you may also like. A show about the things you may also like. Things like...
Andrew, before podcasting, what did you do?
I was a corporate guy. So I came out of business school more than 30 years ago, had those corporate jobs. And then I had someone say to me, by the time you're 30, if you want to do your own business, you better take this leap and do it. I had a gas station, a 24-hour Esso gas station in Toronto, and I operated that for years. And then I did 2 of my own businesses. And then retirement came, so to speak. And this led me into podcasting through COVID.
Was the retirement your choice or their choice?
I had my own small business, and after 10 years it was a rental moving box business. And after 10 years of doing that, it was time for a change, and I found a buyer. It wasn't enough money to retire, but it was enough money to make a change. And so I just happened to be in this career transition point when COVID hit and suddenly discovered podcasting. Didn't even know what it was.
So what was your gateway podcast? What's the first one you listened to and you thought to yourself, this is really interesting?
So with COVID, we all suddenly could only walk. So I started walking like everyone else. And then I found out I could find my radio shows on podcast version when I wanted to hear them. So the Rich Eisen Show, Dan Patrick Show, Jim Rome Show. Loved hearing those stories. And I really enjoyed hearing stories not only with sporting people, but people outside. And they were good at that. And then I said, you know what? I'd really love to talk to people from Toronto. I'm born and bred here. I'd love to hear their stories. And I kind of had that percolating in the back of my head. And then I discovered Mike Boone, Toronto Mike. He was doing interviews with people from Toronto. I said, this is the exact kind of thing I would like to do. Too bad someone beat me to it. I opened my newspaper in March 2022, almost 3 years ago. And the Toronto Star does an amazing story on Mike Boone, Toronto Mike. It was his 1,000th episode. And I was just like, well, someone's already done 1,000 episodes. There's no room for someone else to do this. But within that article, there was a very interesting sentence where Mike Boone said, anyone can get into podcasting. And by the way, I'd love to help them. I picked up the phone, I phoned him. And to his credit, because it would have been really easy to say, hey, buddy, someone's already doing this. There's no room for anyone else. He said, I'd love to do it, which of course was business for him because he'd be producing it. And that's how I got started.
So you and I, roughly the same age. And Gen X, I would say.
I'm about to turn 55.
I'm about to turn 55. Are you a Pisces or are you Aquarius?
February 1, Aquarius.
I'm at the other end of the month. I'm the 28th. So we're practically the same age.
Please respect your elders, Matt.
Well, we're about to both experience Freedom 55 of some sort. But I'm glad you went and called Mike. But I think it's a real Gen X trait to think that when somebody has done something that we can't do it. And I think that's sort of the media we were brought up in. Oh, there's already a show about this. We don't need another one. There's already been a book written about this. Maybe we don't necessarily need another one. There's already a radio station that does sports or rock music. So we don't necessarily want to start another one. We want to start something completely different. But, you talked about I could listen to my favorite show whenever I wanted. And I think that's the real key with podcasting is that you can have 2 podcasts that do something somewhat similar, but they can coexist and the rising tide will lift all boats. And here you are with Mike Boone, who welcomed you with open arms. And not only that, he helped you do a show that was, I don't want to say it's like it, it's similar, but I know that there's a lot of differences with it. What were those first few episodes like and working with Mike, and what were your vision? What was the vision between you to move it forward and grow it?
Well, what was great, Matt, I think, is that I hadn't been in this industry. I didn't know anything about it. So I came in with no preconceived notions of what it should be. I just said, what would I do if I could have a coffee with someone, quote, Toronto famous, someone I knew, and I really wanted to know their story? What would I ask them? And it's very interesting that 3 years later, almost from the first episode, the model was correct in the sense that introduce the person, ask them for their best stories of how they did it, and just listen. And that model's kind of hasn't really changed. So I've definitely gotten a lot better over that time. The first ones were a bit chunky, as with everyone, but the model kind of stayed the same. I love hearing how they did it.
What is Toronto famous?
Well, it's a great question because Toronto famous just means if you grew up in Toronto or you lived in Toronto and you know this person's name, that works. So a great example is someone like Gord Martineau, City Pulse News. City TV is very well known. If you're in Toronto, you knew that, but you might not know him outside of this city. Steve Paikin's hosted TVO's The Agenda for decades. He's one of the most well-known broadcasters in Ontario. Outside of Ontario, you might not know him. Rick Vive scored 50 goals, 3 seasons in Toronto. He's a Toronto legend, but he may not be your number one hockey player if you live outside. So I really wanted to catch up with people who had meaning for me and get their best stories.
So your latest episode is Mike Camilleri, and I'm trying to think back to his career. And I met him in the Winnipeg airport, and my son took a picture. And I'm going to put that picture, by the way, up on the blog for this episode so people can see it. But what makes Mike Toronto famous?
Well, it's a great question because when you go to a subset of Toronto legends, and I make fun of this sometimes, it's York Region legends. So for those who may know, just north and surrounding the city of Toronto proper is York Region, made up of a bunch of cities, including Richmond Hill. And it just so happens that Mike Camilleri is a son of Richmond Hill. He's about to be inducted into the Richmond Hill Sports Hall of Fame. So that's a special feeling for me because he's in the city where I'm based right now. And Mike had his hockey upbringing literally on the ponds of Richmond Hill. He went up through the Toronto minor hockey system, and then he had this fantastic journey through University of Michigan and then to the pros with a variety of teams. And he retired. He almost played 1,000 games, and he even says on the podcast, frankly, he wasn't ready to retire, but for various circumstances, he did. And he's a great example of a really well-known local guy who's a legend around here.
Tell me about some of your early struggles with the podcasting and podcast space. It could have been technical. It could have been marketing. What were some of the things that you would share today with somebody who would be starting a podcast?
Well, the amazing news for anyone starting a podcast is you can just do it. I encourage people to just do it. There's never been a better time in history to be able to do it. But certainly, Matt, my problems were technical. I had no background in anything technical. I had very poor internet, as I recall at the very beginning. I did not have a webcam, and I certainly didn't have any of the equipment. But what's amazing about it is, as you get going, all the technical tools that have been available have been amazing. And to this day, I would suggest to you, I'm producing a podcast that's pretty on par with most other podcasts. I'm doing it myself. I learned myself, and it's just so many tools out there. So that was a great learning curve. A lot of lessons learned.
So a lot of people will ask this question, and I don't like asking it because A, it's nosy, B, it might just be none of my business, but still it keeps coming up. And it's like, how do you monetize your podcast? How do you make it so that, it's part of your sustainable, how do you make it so the show is part of your brand? How do you make it so that it's viable, that you can get to 1,000 episodes like Toronto Mike did?
Well, bad news. It is not a great way to make money. And my best advice to anyone is to take the pressure off yourself and get or keep your job. And so for me, Toronto Legends podcast is a passion thing. I love it. I do 2 per week. We publish on Mondays and Thursdays, 3 years. We just hit our 300th interview. I will do this for the rest of my life. That does not pay the bills. So on the podcast front, the first thing I did, and I'm proud to say I did, is instead of paying money out of my pocket, I have now reached cost neutrality. I am not losing money on every episode, but I have given up the opportunity cost of earning money. So a year and a half ago, I got a job, and I do my job, and luckily it is flexible enough that I can also pursue my podcasting, and that's taken a tremendous amount of pressure off me in terms of trying to monetize.
That's incredible because you've solved, I think, a number of problems for yourself, and you've also told people a little playbook about how to get there. And they say it takes 3 years to build an audience, but you've given yourself the runway, and you've given yourself the ability to, keep it flexible. And I love how you say, I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life. I'm just good. This is just who I am.
I love what I do. And we've all been in a situation where you've seen someone you really looked up to or knew the name of, and someone's interviewing them. You said, I wish I could ask them this. I've been able to give myself that gift. And so a tremendous example has been here in Toronto. My favorite player growing up was Börje Salming. And of course, he's passed on now. But the story of Börje Salming and Inge Hammerstrom coming from Sweden to North America to play for the Toronto Maple Leafs was a big part of my life. And I've gotten to know, and I'm very proud to say it actually considers me a friend now. Jerry McNamara was the general manager of the Leafs. He was a scout for Leafs. He played for Leafs. But when he was a scout, he brought over Börje Salming and Inge Hammerstrom. And a great Toronto Legends example is I was not only able to interview Inge Hammerstrom and interview Jerry McNamara, but I actually was able to reunite them after 50 years to get their stories. And that was very meaningful for me.
So it's fairly incredible with all the people that you're contacting. It's a guest show. And so you've got, guests coming in all the time. There's marketing. I mean, you are your podcast is a marketing tool that must have led to something more than just the stories that you're telling, where people have connected to you in different ways. Has it sort of triggered any interesting sort of growth opportunities, whether it's financially, fellowship, business opportunities, just being known? Because this is what podcasting is really good at, and that's becoming known.
It's absolutely triggered other things. And this is where I think the monetization opportunity may exist. Live event hosting. And what I've realized is a lot of people go out and speak, even people who professionally speak for their career. When they're left alone, they go off the rails. Everyone needs a speaker's sidekick. So that's what I've pitched myself as. I will go up and introduce the speaker, cue him up for his best or her best stories, and then kind of moderate the audience Q&A, and then help with the post engagement, photos, autographs, book signings. And I've been doing that for live books, but also doing it for alumni associations. So one big side thing that's come out of this is the NHL Alumni Luncheon. It's a monthly luncheon. I have managed to weasel my way in there, and I am now the co-host of this event. So not only do I get to live interview a lot of people that I've done for the podcast, but I get to broaden my network, and this will become something to be monetized in the future as I get better known and people are more aware of my skill set.
So this is fairly incredible. So you're hitting the 3-year mark, and of course, I always like to say it takes 3 years to build an audience, and now it's almost like the plane is getting ready to take off and you're moving on to an incredible venture.
Absolutely. I mean, I've enjoyed it. I enjoy it more every time. And now that I have this back catalog of 300, which by the way blows my mind, it gives me more credibility when I ask the next set of guests to come on. And I'd have to say, Matt, overall, people have been very willing to come on. Part of that is naivete. Who there's no way to know whether Toronto Legends is the Joe Rogan podcast or it's just some guy out of his house. And so they've been much more willing to accept an invitation to be on than they would if, for example, they were asked to appear at a show or on a TV program or something where they knew the ranking of it, so to speak.
So I'm going to ask you to give away a little bit more of the secret sauce. You can only give away just as much as you really want, but that's booking guests. And I know a lot of people give up because it's like, well, it's hard to book guests. And you mentioned you've got a job that is a little bit flexible too. So how do you book guests? How do you juggle that? And how do you, what's the secret sauce to getting the guests and nailing down the time so you can record a show?
I'm so glad you asked. Just ask. And you have to have the right personality, Matt. You have to be willing to be ignored. You have to be willing to be rejected. And I just ask, but it's never been an easier time. So just as an example, finding someone's email address has never been easier. On LinkedIn, you can make connections, and if people connect with you, they give you their contact info. It has never been an easier time to reach out to people. 99% of people reject or ignore me, but resiliency is so important, and I just don't get bothered by that. I never have taken it personally. And when I first started this for Toronto Legends, I said, who would I want to talk to that was a Toronto famous person? It didn't take 5 minutes for me to have a list of 200 people. This was 3 years ago. And you just keep knocking them off. And in a city as big and as rich as Toronto, and a country as big and rich as Canada, there's just an endless supply of people that I'd want to talk to. So I haven't run out. I keep asking. And I've been really pleasantly surprised. The 1% that do agree, it fills the schedule.
Did you know you'd be a storyteller?
I'm not a storyteller, I'm a story capturer, and I want to mention that because this is not a conversation show. This is an interview show. Nobody, including my mother, is listening for me. They're listening for the guests. And so I want to capture their stories. I also want to capture their stories. I don't want their opinions or their takes. Anybody can go to any sports bar or your own family room and capture anyone's opinion on anything. I want to hear the story of XYZ or this incident or this part of your life that resonates with me and hopefully other people. And that's what I do.
So I really love the name of the show, Toronto Legends. So one of the things I think is very encouraging when you ask somebody to appear on the show, they're a legend. So you've complimented them before they've even come in the door. It's fantastic.
I have to tell you, that has been a big one. And a lot of people have said, I don't consider myself a legend. And so you're correct. It was well named. And I give the credit to my Montreal-born wife, Vicky. She came up with that name and it has worked out great. And I do want to add, Matt, it's somewhat interesting that the bigger names that you reach out to are the easier to get and the more direct to get. It's the people in that mushy middle or people that have someone in between that have been more challenging. But I got one great example for you. I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to interview our ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray. Bob Ray is the sitting ambassador to the United Nations. He has better things to do, but not only did he deal with me directly, once he booked his day and time, he was on time, he was ready and focused, and he answered everything beautifully. And as soon as our time was up, he literally got up, thanked me, and went off to a meeting with the U.S. ambassador. He had other things to do, but he was so genuine and so willing to share his amazing life story. I really enjoyed that. That was a very meaningful example of someone very big who had time for little old me.
One of the things that I think your listeners do is that they will go through your catalog and choose an episode of a story they want to hear. And I'm going to give an example because I'm traveling today and just having scrolled through the feed for Toronto Legends, there's Kevin Lowe. And Kevin Lowe, I'm not even sure what his connection is to Toronto. I don't even care. I just want to hear the story because I know just enough about Kevin that his family has a dairy farm in Lachute, Quebec, which was near where I was. And he played in Edmonton for many years, and those Oilers have a zillion stories. I think he went to New York as well, so then you get a whole bunch more stories. I can't wait to check out that episode today. But I think there's so much, for people to choose from. It's just worth, a follow, and it's worth a follow on your Apple device or Spotify.
It 100% is, and I'm glad you brought that up, Matt. Nobody has listened to all 300 of my episodes, and I don't encourage you to listen to all 300 because you have to be interested in the person. And one of the ads I run within my own interviews is, here's 300 episodes, scroll through them, just like you said, and only listen to the ones that interest you. There's nobody on the planet or nobody even in my ecosystem that wants to hear all 300 of them. But I guarantee you will find someone that does interest you because we cover sports, music, business, arts, media, broadcasting. There will be names that will resonate with you. I promise you that.
Do you look at the downloads and count and think about them?
Absolutely not. I did. And at the beginning I did. And you can cut this out if you want. I give you amazing credit. Matt Kundle, I want to thank you a lot. There was a point where after I'd gotten started, I was kind of like, wow, this isn't really going anywhere. And I didn't have that job yet. So the pressure was on to monetize. And you were so good at calming me down and giving me that rule of thumb in 3 years till you build an audience and you'll get there. Just keep going. And I think it was very important for that reason, just to be consistent and do what you enjoy and kind of follow your own instincts, so to speak. I love doing it. I thought I was on the right track. And in the wake, a lot of much better people than me in terms of their well-knownness and their ability to be in the industry have fallen by the wayside. And you know the stats. These aren't the exact ones, but the gist of it is a minority of podcasts actually produce multiple episodes. Let's say 10 is like with a cutoff. People don't seem to get past 10 episodes. And the other criteria of being able to do it consistently over time, that rarely happens. There's so many orphan podcasts out there. So I'm proud. 3 years later, 300 episodes, I'm going to keep going.
So one of the other great things I love about your show is, I forgot about that guy. Right?
Well, this is especially interesting to you because, as we've noted, we're the exact same age. And if you're into 80s music or 70s, 80s hockey, or 70s, 80s, 90s broadcasting, you will recognize those names and you'll say, I didn't know that guy was still around. And the best example has been 80s music. There's a real resurgence of 80s music, and the tours are going on nonstop. I've interviewed 3 of the founding members of Glass Tiger. I had Ive and Doris Chuck from Men Without Hats, Jean-Marc Pisapia from The Box. But then I've also had some more international acts, let's call them. Tom Bailey from Thompson Twins, Jack Hughes from Wang Chung. Get it? Jack Hughes, that's his stage name. And Rudy Sarzo, who plays with Ozzy. And guess what? He was sleeping on Ozzy's bus that when Randy Rhoads flew his airplane into the ground and clipped that bus. I mean, he was there at that time, which is amazing. So again, names that may or may not resonate with you, but if they do, you sure say, boy, I wonder what happened with that guy and what his story was.
Yeah, I love you mentioned The Box and you mentioned Men Without Hats. When you mentioned, Jean-Marc from The Box, I'm thinking to myself, those are Montrealers, but they're appearing on Toronto Legends. But at the same time, I mean, I recognize as a Montrealer that so much goes down the 401, based on the politics, including your wife, by the way. It's just, that's what happens to Montrealers is they wind up sort of going down the 401.
And if I may, Matt, I'll tell you it was something interesting. Jean-Marc was the keyboardist for Men Without Hats, and he left that band to create his own right before the Safety Dance came out. Jean-Marc and I even went to school together, and they're still friends.
Really?
And I'll tell you something else interesting, because the Montreal connection is very strong, and a lot of my guests have Montreal stories. The broadcaster Jim Lang, who today is the morning man at our local radio station, York Region, he was covering the Habs in that 93 playoff run, and he's got really amazing, dynamic, vibrant stories that he shared that resonate with all of us because we all remember that. And since you mentioned it, I am going to tell you, in 93, when we, the Toronto Maple Leafs, should have been playing against the Montreal Canadiens in the final, the famous missed call by Kerry Fraser of the high stick, Wayne Gretzky, high stick, Doug Gilmour. Well, you know who else was on the ice at that exact moment? Mark Osborne, who played for your Winnipeg Jets later. Well, Mark Osborne's been on the podcast, and what a great moment for me to be able to capture the story of him standing there, seeing Gretzky, high stick, Gilmour, it not being called, and that was very meaningful to me.
Boy, are you ever on brand with the Toronto Legends, not letting that 93 incident go. Just you would have been boat raced by the Habs in the next series.
Well, we will never know, but certainly a missed opportunity.
Yeah. Andrew, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today and talk about your podcast, Toronto Legends. There's always a great story inside.
It's been my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all your support. And it is torontolegends.ca. Always welcoming your guest suggestions.
Thanks for listening to You May Also Like. You may also like our website at youmayalsolike.net. The show is produced by Evan Serminski and built for your ears by everyone at the Sound Off Media Company.